Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Eco India, I welcome you all to the COVID education series and today's webinar. Amid the pandemic, Eco India is committed towards providing right information using the virtual platforms. Hence, the COVID 19 series has brought together national experts to connect with health service providers and from government and private sector with reliable and trusted information on COVID 19. In the second wave, we saw and heard of hospitals' caseload, infrastructure challenges, and success and failure of health facilities to handle the caseload. In today's session, we will know more on how to strengthen the health system and structure to combat any unforeseen situation. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Sandeep Bhalla, Associate Vice President at Eco India, to formally start the session. Over to you, Dr. Bhalla.
Thank you, Deepa. First of all, very warm welcome. Good evening to all the healthcare professionals, those who have joined from the nooks and corners of our country in our educational series, which Eco India, that is Extension for Community Healthcare Outcome, has started from last month. Today, we are going to have the 15th session of this particular series, and we are getting the tremendous response, and we are covering the various aspects of the subjects related to COVID-19. Even as the second wave of COVID-19 pandemic wanes in the India, 5 states still reported more than 1 lakh cases over the last 2 weeks, with Tamil Nadu on the top, followed by Kerala, Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Andhra. However, all these states have made a significant progress in containment efforts, bringing down the total count of cases by almost 40% or more, as compared to a couple of fortnights ago. The number of active cases of coronavirus infection in the country has also come down to 8,26,740. A total of 2,330 fatalities being reported in the span of 24 hours. This is again a warning sign for all of us. Taking the cumulative deaths to more than 3,81,000. It is rising on day by day. As India battles with the huge crisis, we at Eco India deeply value the role of the educational webinar series and appreciate the role of everyone, especially the healthcare workforce, to combat this growing burden. As we fight this pandemic, we Eco India thought that let this COVID-19 webinar educational series should be fruitful for disseminating the right information to the right people at the right time. India has faced disasters, and we have witnessed a broken healthcare system, sick patients, choked hospitals, death fears in all Indians, and multiplying corona cases. The deadly second wave of corona has put up healthcare system of India out of gear, as we all know, and Delhi has suffered a much bigger way as compared to the other metro cities also. Amid this massive surge in the second wave of COVID-19, which has caused a visible strain on the healthcare system in terms of shortage of beds, ICUs, oxygens, ventilators, medicines, healthcare personnel in India have been trying to do their best under trying circumstances. Stretched to the breaking point, the pressure of the work and the shortage of material during the second wave has caused deaths that could have been avoidable. In this context, the topic for the today's webinar, we have kept very thoughtful way, that is operating healthcare facilities during pandemic and beyond. And we have among with us very eminent national expert leader, that is Dr. Colonel Rakesh Verma sir. Dr. Verma is CEO of Aeon Med Health and Hospitals, a consulting company specializing in hospital and healthcare quality accreditation, operations, learning and development systems, performance and productivity. He is a consultant speaker, teacher, trainer for hospital and healthcare systems also. He's also my senior from my alma mater. I'm lucky to have him with me. A veteran from Army Medical Corps of the Indian Army and alumni of prestigious FMC Pune and AIMS New Delhi. He is an established healthcare quality and management specialist and has been principal advisor with NABH over a decade. Sir is specializing in learning systems for healthcare, hospital planning and designing, and healthcare HR and risk management in the healthcare. He also serves as the program director of Research Foundation for Hospital and Healthcare Administration, New Delhi, and editor for International Journal of Research Foundation of Hospital and Health Administration. Not taking time more, I would just request my respected senior, Dr. Colonel Rakesh Verma sir, to take over the lead today. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Deepa, and thank you, Dr. Sandeep Bhalla. Is my voice audible?
Perfectly fine, sir.
Okay, great. So thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this platform. And also I understand, and in fact, I deeply appreciate the initiative that has been taken by Eco India and the kind of impact it is making. Amid this pandemic, there is, if I can say that, there is a deluge of information. The quantum of information that we have available to us is huge. And the challenge that comes to a lot of us is to make sense of that, make sense of all the recommendations that come on a daily basis. You have, on one hand, science about the coronavirus evolving at a rapid pace. Every day we are learning something or the other. On the other hand, the soldiers on ground, the people who are working in the hospitals, need to get actionable advice and actionable information that they can translate into their daily practice. So the topic today is operating healthcare facilities during pandemic and beyond. I'll begin with this topic and I'll just share the screen. So just give me a couple of seconds. So I hope the screen is visible.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so with this, the topic that we have today is operating healthcare facilities during pandemic and beyond. And I'm going to cover this topic under these headings. It is essential to understand how the COVID-19 as an entity has impacted the healthcare facilities. We know the impacts on populations and societies and economies, but let's see how it has impacted the healthcare facilities. We need to look at what is the overall approach to patient care. Eventually, in order to address the pandemic, we will have to be in a position where we are able to not only preserve our health infrastructure and health facilities, but also to be able to operate in such a manner that these services are available. It makes no sense if the health system gets overwhelmed, it gets affected by the pandemic itself and is not able to respond. So the overall approach to patient care we will see. We'll also see what new needs to be done in order to have the effective infection control in the hospitals. The way the pandemic has progressed, the way the transmissibility of the virus is there, it keeps, if I can say that, it keeps evolving with every new variant that comes in. So we will need to understand how to design or how to repurpose or redesign our systems so that we are able to address the requirements of infection control. We will need to look at all the armaments that we have in our kitty, what all is available, and therefore once we understand what is available, once we understand how these various methods and measures work and how they can be deployed, we'll be able to make a better control on we'll have a better systems to control the infections, especially the COVID-19. And then we need to also address the requirements of non-COVID clinical care. This is one aspect which obviously has taken the backseat because the pandemic was raging at a scale unprecedented. And therefore, as the pandemic now comes somewhat under control, as the systems and as the time passes, we will need to be prepared to provide non-COVID clinical care as well. Please remember that there is a huge requirement, a huge need of healthcare services, which in the middle of the pandemic gets unaddressed. All the elective procedures, all the non-COVID emergencies, they are affected because the health system gets geared, or rather it is forced to respond to the pandemic requirements. So we will need a method to understand how to move from the current situation to be able to provide non-COVID clinical care as well. So there is a framework which I'll be sharing. So first, the impact on the healthcare facilities. A lot of it is common sense. A lot of it is also visible and has been shared. And those of you who are in the healthcare systems and also working in the hospitals, you would have seen some parts of it. So first and foremost, there has been a crisis in public health. I think this is not new. The scale of pandemic has brought serious issues to the public health. The health systems have been overwhelmed. This is one aspect which is very, very visible. The financial health of the hospitals has also suffered, because on one hand there are a range of health services on the patient care services which are no longer being provided, and therefore there are losses. On the other hand, the hospitals are gearing up to cater to the new requirements. So this has created tremendous financial pressures on the hospitals, and this has also been visible and been discussed at various forums in the country as well, and also in many other countries where the pandemic has caused such large-scale disruptions. The health insurance gets undermined in the sense that the claims rise, and therefore there is an impact on the health insurance. I'm not covering this aspect here today, but suffice to understand that this is one side of the healthcare system that has also been adversely affected. Exacerbated social disparities. We know that the pandemic has resulted in loss of jobs. There is a serious impact on the economy, and people have lost their livelihoods, people have lost their incomes, they have lost their savings while they have battled with the COVID-19. So the societal disparities which existed have been exacerbated, and there is an impact. And in fact, if you analyze how the governments have responded, a lot of effort has also been to support people who have been whose livelihood and whose income levels have dropped in this pandemic. There is a huge psychosocial impact. So we are aware that the pandemic has caused this. This impact is seen when you have people losing their loved ones, people not in a position to respond to the requirement despite the fact that they are there, but the health system is overwhelmed. The pandemic has resulted in such increased demand of the health services that the systems are not able to provide. So there are psychosocial impacts on the impacts which are visible. The hospitals, as far as hospitals are concerned, they are expected to respond, and the response is expected to be escalated, enhanced, and at the same time there is a fall in revenue which affects their day-to-day operations. So this results eventually, and I'm personally aware this has happened in lots of hospitals, where the hospitals have been forced to scale down their staff strength, essentially because the revenues have fallen, and therefore they are not in a position to run the services at a level where they were running it before the pandemic. Then there is exhaustion of health workforce. The people who are working in the hospitals, the doctors, nurses, paramedical staff, in fact, every category of staff is required to work extended hours. The shifts have, the number of hours on shifts have increased, the workload has increased, and this has resulted in exhaustion of workforce. This is also one of the impact on the health systems. There is a huge backlog of normal care. So all the elective procedures, all the other healthcare needs, the chronic diseases, the emergencies, the acute exacerbations of the chronic diseases, all that has taken a hit, and there is now a backlog that needs to be addressed. There are design implications because the specialized facilities are required, specialized equipment is required. We know how the shortage of ventilators had affected the care, and in the second wave, the shortage of oxygen, the shortage of capability of the hospitals to provide oxygen made headlines just very recently, about a month back. So there are design implications. There are implications in terms of how, in what kind of facilities the patients are housed. So the requirements of isolation facilities have escalated hugely. You need the kind of specialized services which were which were not required before this pandemic. The new skills are required. The number of times or the number of occasions that the hospital staff is now required to operate and maintain ventilators is far more than what it used to be. So the new training is required, and new equipment, of course, with increase in the requirement of critical care, you have requirement of all the equipment that is required for the critical care. Then there are supply chain issues. One of the non-pharmaceutical response to the pandemic has been lockdown. Every country has done it. This was necessary to disrupt the chain of transmission. However, lockdown also affects the supply chains. There will be disruptions. There is an issue that the supplies are not available. The hospitals may not have adequate reserves. In fact, even at the regional level, there may not be adequate reserves, as we saw in the case of oxygen in recent times. So these supplies have to be then hauled from a long distances, and this has its own logistic challenges. So there are supply chain issues, and then there are health operations issues. In fact, this is the point of focus today. So there are issues relating to staffing. So staff is overworked, and at the same time, the financial pressures are causing hospitals to not in a position to really enhance the staff that they could possibly, or they would want to. The workloads have mounted. There are technical issues. The requirements of the specialized treatment of the COVID hospitals, biomedical waste, it has to be done in a different manner, not the way with which we have been used to. There are requirements of segregation, protecting people, the aerosol control. In fact, as we progressed through the pandemic through last year and a half, we have seen that the aerosol has assumed significance in terms of the way the virus spreads. And aerosol control is one of the important requirement in the hospitals. Before this pandemic, we were not really, geared up to provide or to organize our services in such a manner that they give effective aerosol control. There were facilities. We had BSL-2 level labs. They were essentially restricted to labs. It was essentially restricted to possibly the chemotherapy centers. But the way the aerosol control is required for handling the COVID patient is different. So therefore, this is a new challenge that has come. And I have talked about the skill sets that are required. So skill sets will have its own issues. You need to train people. You need to bring people to a certain level of proficiency before they can be interested to work independently. This obviously has an impact. Then there are issues of public anger, because there is an expectation that the certain level of care will be provided, and when the hospitals are overwhelmed, naturally that level of care may not be available. And then we have seen multiple instances of public anger manifesting in more complaints, manifesting in violence against the healthcare workers, manifesting in many other ways. And a large amount of anger, to my understanding, also remains unexpressed. So essentially, the anger at not being able to help or not being able to get help is something that has happened in this. And the important part, which is going to be our discussion today, is the infection control. The way our systems were organized to provide infection control in our pre-pandemic times was essentially to was in a certain manner. Now the COVID-19 has changed all that. We now know that aerosol is very significant. We now know that the contaminated surfaces are the culprit. We also know that there is a requirement of a mask screening and so on. So the infection control is something that has totally, it has changed the way we need to address it. So we will cover this aspect because the other aspects of providing more staff, providing equipment, providing possibly training, that is there. But when we get down to actually operating hospitals, one of the challenges that we have is to protect ourselves, the healthcare workers, and the other patients from infections that will be brought in by all the patients who walk in. And we need to create systems where we are able to screen them, where we are able to triage them, and therefore we are able to identify that this is a suspected case, or this possibly is a person who is not at the moment in a position or in a state to transmit the virus. So this is something that needs to be done. And if we really look at the experience of pandemics and new diseases that have emerged in, let us say, past 50 years, the agent of the disease, the virus, will stay. So whatever we may do, whatever public health measures, whatever vaccination programs, and all that will happen, but we will never possibly be free of COVID-19. We will always have to be prepared to address this. We will need to be aware that how it spreads and how we design our infection control systems in order to be able to address this requirement. So this is what we are going to discuss in greater details today. So the overall approach is fourfold. So it is four-pronged approach. We need to look at four different aspects. First one is reduce the need to visit. Now this is something that needs to be learned, because so far we were all talking and we were all aware that in case of doubt, meet the doctor and visit the hospital and get it resolved. But the requirement of protecting the patients as well as everyone else, the need is to reduce visits to the hospital. How we do this, we will come to some of the ways in which it can be done. So the one approach, the first part of the approach is to reduce the need to visit. We will explore each of these in more details as we go along. Then the second approach is to detect, isolate, and treat. So we need to have systems in place where we are able to detect the people with infection. We are able to then segregate them and treat them before we, when we are treating patients in the hospital. The third is to prioritize non-COVID care. This is something that we will have to start doing it. Eventually, you can't defer the chronic disease management indefinitely. The care will have to be provided. You will have patients who need reviews, who need repeat investigations, who need advices, who need treatment modifications. So whatever else is required, this needs to be done. So prioritizing non-COVID care is the fourth approach, third approach. And the fourth is to protect the healthcare personnel, that is HCPs, and the healthcare facilities. Preserving these two categories of resource that we have, the healthcare facilities and the healthcare personnel, is critical, because in the absence of these, all others fall flat. So therefore, these are the four overall approaches that we need to have. The new infection control paradigm, because we've talked about it, the need to have infection control systems in place so that we are able to detect and able to avoid infections. So the new paradigm centers around regulating access. So everyone cannot just walk into a hospital. I think henceforth we will have to have a situation where there is some kind of a screening, there is some kind of a barrier that is put, so that everybody who enters the hospital goes through a system of filtration or a triage or a sorting. So regulating access is the first part of this whole paradigm, where you need to regulate access not only for patients, for visitors, but also for your own staff. Then identifying cases and suspected cases. So we will see how it is done. Essentially, you either look for the symptoms that are telltale symptoms of the COVID-19 infection, fever, sore throat, etc. Or you do the screening either by a rapid antigen test or by the RT-PCR. Now, it had both these tests have their own issues. We will cover them shortly. Then there is need to be a universal source control. Now, this is the term that has been used by the Centers for Disease Control, that is CDC in US. The universal source control we will discuss, we will cover that also. But it's, just to put it very simply, it means that you enforce masking and you enforce that every person, or you assume every person to be the potential carrier of the virus, and that a person can infect others. So therefore, you enforce masking, you enforce certain kind of behavior, what has been named as the COVID appropriate behavior. And then personal protection, this is applicable to the healthcare workers and also to the patients. So now let us look at what are the measures and methods that we have available with us. So the first one is telemedicine and telehealth, and now you can keep relating these methods with the 4 approaches that we saw. So telemedicine and telehealth is basically useful for screening, triage, and so I'll just list them out and then we'll go to each one of them. So telemedicine and telehealth, screening, triage, and evaluation to detect cases, universal source control, and engineering controls for improving the indoor air quality. IAQ is indoor air quality. Targeted testing, processes to respond to the exposures of healthcare personnel. What happens when a person is exposed? So this protocol has to be put in place. Patient placement, how the patients are housed inside the hospital, in what manner. Then we look at the controlling aerosol generating procedures. Aerosol is now recognized as one of the important ways in which the virus spreads. Limiting visitor access, environmental infection control, air infection isolation rooms. This is required for handling the COVID-19 patients, and we will see what category of patients go here. And then PPEs, including respirators. Now we have all seen PPEs in over the last year and a half. We are all aware. So my idea will not be to really go over the PPEs that are there, but we will look at some of the important aspects of how PPEs need to be used. So coming to the first one, the telemedicine and telehealth, it reduces the need to visit. Obviously, one of the approach is to reduce the need. So this is the telemedicine comes handy for that. It is useful for patient screening. It is useful for triaging for non-COVID urgent care. So you have a person with any of these chronic diseases, hypertension, diabetes, CAD, etc., under regular treatment, and this person requires attention. So telemedicine comes in here, where you are able to screen, you are able to triage that whether a person should actually visit the hospital or the matter can be resolved without visiting. Then this telemedicine can address chronic conditions and medication management. So it also works as adjunct to physical or physiotherapy, where the patients can be guided and educated over this medium. Monitoring and follow-up can be done, and non-emergent care to those on long-term acute care. Lastly, education and training. So these are the requirements for which a patient need not visit the hospital. This essentially reduces the footfall in the hospital and therefore helps us in running our systems better, helps us in protecting our staff better. There are issues related to telemedicine. So the one of the foremost issues was, at least till last year, was the legal sanction, which is now available. So there is a clear telemedicine guideline from the National Medical Commission, which is applicable. Now, the privacy requirements, the validity of prescription, the limitations in clinical judgment, and patient satisfaction have all been addressed in the telemedicine guideline. I'll urge all of you to, all of you who are, using telemedicine as a medium for patient interactions, please have a look at this guideline. In summary, the guideline demands that the level of privacy that is privacy and confidentiality that is available to the patient must be same as for in-person consultations. The prescriptions need to be valid. There has to be identification of the doctor and the identification of the patient. So both the identities have to be established. And then the medium itself has certain limitations in terms of how the clinical judgments, or the quality of clinical judgment. Essentially because it is different. It is different from the in-person consultations. The examination cannot be done. The patient interaction is of a different kind. So the doctor needs to be aware that the clinical judgments that he is making through the telemedicine platform has limitations. And this is what is the essential requirement. Then there are issues of patient satisfaction because the patient actually not had an interaction with the doctor in terms of face-to-face interaction. So the patient satisfaction also may not be that high. However, this is something that we need to understand and we need to address when we are using telemedicine. I have already covered the ways in which telemedicine makes an impact. We need to use platforms that provide built-in privacy and the best possible video quality, because video happens to be the only way one can see the patient. There are specialized platforms available now. So these can be used, and they can also be used for recording the prescriptions, for recording the consultation as such. And this is necessary because when there is a claim subsequently, the patient has an issue, then the recording comes in handy. It also helps the doctor to recollect as to what transpired in the previous consultation. There is also a need for both the providers and the patients to be trained on the medium. So this interaction is, though not very complicated, it's easy to learn. And in any case, with the lockdowns, we have all become accustomed to using the video platforms for interactions. But patients may need to learn. We need to remember that there will be a large number of patients who may not be comfortable with such a medium, so they need to be trained. At least they need to be guided as to how they should use this medium. And we need to develop triage protocols and be aware of identifiable warning signs for detecting potential serious conditions. So one of the foremost decisions that needs to be made while doing a telemedicine consultation is whether this patient who is now in front of me through a video consultation, does he require in-person care and therefore needs to be directed to a hospital. This is an important aspect of the telemedicine care. And then we need to remember, in terms of the telemedicine guidelines, the liabilities still lie with the provider. So if you have a provider, the hospital making the telemedicine facility available, so the liability still is with the hospital. That's what the guideline says. The next armament that we have with us is the screening, triage, and re-evaluation. So we need to screen all those who enter the healthcare facilities. This, I think, is easy to understand. Triage protocols to detect the suspected cases. So we need to list symptoms, signs, and tests that will be done. Contain and manage suspected or confirmed cases, important for the hospitals. Limit access or entry points. This is also need to be done for the hospital staff. I'm sure you also would have seen, I have seen it in multiple hospitals, where there is a very strict control on who can enter as far as patients or the visitors are concerned. But the hospital staff on many occasions has a free run. Now, please remember that hospital staff is also interacting with general public when they go home, when they go to the market, when they outside their duty hours. So we need to have a similar control for them as well. Re-evaluate those suspected. So we have first screening. A lot of hospitals do rapid antigen testing because it can be done in a very short span of 5 to 10 minutes. It gives a result, fairly sensitive, though there is a certain percentage of false negative as well, but fairly sensitive. So this has been used. So a lot of hospitals, what they do is they have a two-step process. So you have a first step where you do a screening, and then you have a re-evaluation, maybe 5 to 7 days later in the hospital. So this increases the hospital stay of the patients, but obviously it is effective because if a person was not detected to be positive on day one, and if he was in the window period, then he will definitely be tested positive by 7th day. So that's how it works. Enforcing mask use and hand hygiene, yes, it is part of the universal source control. So this brings us to the third topic, the third armament that we have. So we need to use mask, a face mask or a respirator to cover nose and mouth to prevent spread of respiratory secretions. So here the sole issue is how do we control or prevent the spread of respiratory secretions while talking, while breathing, while sneezing, or while coughing. So these devices protect the wearer. They also protect the other persons. Ensuring proper fit is important for many of these devices, and I will cover them. That it is required to learn how to wear them and how to check the fit. A lot of times, we may not be really aware how to wear N95 mask, for example, and we wear it in a manner in which it is comfortable for us. Now, if there are gaps between the skin and the edges of the mask, then obviously it is leaking air, and it is also leaking all the respiratory secretions that are supposed to be prevented from spread. It is applicable to all the patients and visitors. So the universal source control is for patients and visitors, and as far as healthcare personnel are concerned, they use PPE. It is not applicable to those under 2 years of age, those who are disabled, those who are not able to wear masks safely, those who may be unconscious, may be incapacitated for any reason, or those who are unable to remove it without assistance. So these are the category of people who should not be forced to wear masks. So these are guidelines. This is based on the guidelines from the CDC Atlanta, that's US agency. Within the third point, we also have the requirement of engineering control. Now, engineering control deals with the air changes and the air recirculation. We know that in centrally air-conditioned systems or the HVAC systems, the air is recirculated, and that is what makes the inside the internal environment comfortable in terms of the temperature and the humidity. But we need to have a sufficient number of air changes and prevent air recirculation. So there are detailed guidelines given by the Indian Society of Heating, Refrigerating and Air Conditioning Engineers. I have given the link here. You can have a look at it, or in fact, simply on Google search for ISHRE guidelines and you will get them. The salient features I'll be covering. So this has to be a non-recirculatory area. So wherever you have HVAC systems in the hospital, where there is a central air conditioning, this has to be a non-recirculatory system, which means the air will not be recirculated. This is also known as 100% once-through system. That means air comes into the room just once, and thereafter it is exhausted and the fresh air is brought in. The air source of AHUs, the AHU is called the air handling units, and all the hospitals have it. So the air source, the source from where the AHU is taking the air in, needs to be outside the building. We need to have 12 air changes per hour minimum, and the extract air vent just above the patient's head. Now this is possible when you have a new facility being created, particularly when you are creating temporary facilities for housing COVID patients. In the hospitals which are already existing and functional, this facility may not be possible because the air vents or the exhaust vents which are there in the central air conditioning system, they are already fixed and they are already placed in a certain position. So what can be done? So what we can do is possibly, this will have to be seen in the context and in every patient care area where it is whether it is possible there, that you realign the bed arrangement in such a manner that the patient's head is near the extract air vent. Why? Because when the patient is the source of infection and he is giving out the respiratory secretions in the form of aerosols, these are directly taken away in the exhaust air vent. So that's the logic. So treat exhaust air by any of these methods. So the methods available are the HEPA filtration, the chemical treatment, which is by bubbling the air through 1% sodium hypochlorite, or by having the ultraviolet lamps installed in the air vent ducts, or heating the air up to 75 degrees centigrade for 45 minutes. Now, the last method is the costliest because you need to have so much of heating. And in a country like ours, when you heat the air, you will need to then spend more effort to cool it down to bring it to the comfortable temperatures. So heating is very expensive, but this is also one of the methods available. HEPA filtration is possibly the simplest because you install it once and it functions for a considerable period of time. Chemical treatment again requires tweaking or rearranging the HVAC system. Ultraviolet lamps also can be put, but then we need to be aware that in the ducts, the lamps have to be put in such a manner that the UV radiation is available throughout the duct. So there are the nuances which are linked with this, which need to be addressed. And using PPE, this is important that when the HVAC systems are being maintained, the PPE must be used by the maintenance staff. So this is a picture that shows that you have a room and the patient's bed, and there is an air vent which is just above the patient's head. Now, this is obviously ideal situation, may not be possible in many circumstances, and therefore, when it is not possible, we need to possibly increase the number of air changes that are recommended. The other methods of engineering control are providing physical barriers. So when you have a COVID hospital or a part of the hospital looking after the COVID patients, so you restrict entry to those places. So those corridors and those rooms are barred. Everybody else is banned from entering those places. There is a facility of remote triage of patients in the patient intake area. So this can be the emergency departments or the OPDs. So you need to have a triage systems there. Use the vacuum shrouds or boxes for aerosol generating procedure. I have shown one such here in the picture. So when the intubation is being done, when the anesthetists are or the critical care specialists are handling patients, when you are handling ventilators, you need to use these vacuum shrouds or boxes, basically to prevent this aerosol from spreading into the room. Then eliminating or reducing care in the open bay recovery areas. We have in our emergency departments where you have open bays, you have open spaces where there is a facility for treating the patients. Now those kind of open spaces are no longer safe because one patient, if he gives out the aerosol, it will affect everyone who's there in the open space. So we need to either eliminate, provide care in the rooms or have the HVAC systems tweaked in such a manner that the air is taken away from the room quickly. Then targeted testing, so pre-admission or pre-procedure testing by either RT-PCR or the rapid antigen tests. The issues are false negative results, especially with the rapid antigen test. Even with RT-PCR, there have been reports of the false negative, but this happens when the sample has not been collected correctly. So there will be issues of false negative result during incubation period when the patient, the viral load may be such that it cannot be detected. time required for testing, there is an issue. So if a result is giving you, if the test is giving you a result in 10 minutes, maybe it is possible to use it. But if it takes a couple of hours, then obviously you can't use it for your routine screening. You can still use it for pre-admission. Then availability of tests and the costs are involved. So these are the issues. For non-emergent care, the RT-PCR continues to be recommended. But yes, in India, you need to look at local regulations. Several state governments had separate guidelines about the circumstances when the RT-PCR can be used. So please look into those guidelines because they will be, these are the local law of the land. However, the RT-PCR continues to be the gold standard as far as the COVID-19 testing is concerned. For emergent care and screening, rapid antigen test is a good alternative. The only problem is that the negatives will need to be confirmed by the RT-PCR, but it does reduce the need for RT-PCR testing. So in a way, it saves the resource and also time. A lot of hospitals do two-stage testing. So you have one test being done pre-admission, then you hold the patients for 5 to 7 days in a separate segregated area, and then test him again. So this increases the hospital stay, but it's a very effective strategy because it very, very effectively eliminates or rather is able to identify the patients who are either suspected or confirmed cases. Next one is process to respond to the exposures of the healthcare personnel. So we need to have processes for identifying as to who is responsible for identifying contacts. Now, in the normal circumstances, you have infection control nurses who do the contact tracing. So you could augment their number or train others to function as the infection control nurse and train them how to identify the contacts and notify the potentially exposed individuals. For example, I may have examined a patient or treated a patient today, and this patient turns out to be positive 3 days later. But unless that information reaches me, I will never know that I am potentially exposed. So therefore, somebody has to be responsible for arranging this. And we also need to figure out how the notifications will occur. There has to be an administrative procedure defined in the hospital. And then what actions will be taken. So once detected that, yes, I was exposed to a patient 3 days back, what actions, what kind of quarantine or isolation or any such action that needs to be taken. And when the healthcare professionals are suspected or confirmed, having confirmed infection, when can they return from work? These are very clearly laid down in the Government of India guidelines, but these need to be translated into the hospital systems as well, so that people are very clearly aware that, okay, this is the number of days for which they need to be under isolation, and thereafter they can return to work, of course, subject to clinical condition. And then the risk assessment and the work restrictions for those who are exposed. So these are the requirements for the healthcare professionals. And this invariably will lead to staff shortages because you will have staff who gets exposed and you will need to quarantine them or isolate them, and that will reduce the number of staff available to you. So the ways in which the hospitals respond is that you shut down other services so that you can continue this service. In a system which is which is overloaded, yes, this is one way, but one could also have additional staff possibly reassigned from other shifts. That's also one of the methods that have been used. Patient placement deals with how the patients are housed in the hospital. So home care is preferred if the condition allows, or in the hospital, patient should be ideally one person per room. But obviously, this will not be possible every time. So when it is not possible, then we look at ventilated areas, we look at good ventilation, we look at air changes. And for patients who are identified as the confirmed cases and who have to undergo aerosol generating procedures, then they should be put in the airborne infection isolation room. These are essentially the negative pressure room where they do not allow any aerosol to escape outside the room. So these are the rooms where these procedures can be conducted. Compulsorily use the PPE in the dedicated areas where we are treating COVID patients. and only assign the staff who is supposed to be working there. So you can say that, okay, these are the 10 people who are working in that area, and only those people go there. So this helps in reducing the PPE consumption as well. Though it is not now a serious concern, but yes, it's also an expense that needs to be controlled. Do not house COVID patients with other patients, including the suspected ones. So, including the undiagnosed ones. The suspected patients and the confirmed patients can be in one room. The other aspects are limiting movement or the transfers of patients. So, when you are moving patients, there is a requirement when you are moving patients for CT scan, for MRI. So the only thing is that you minimize such movement, you limit such movement so that the patient is not floating all over the hospital. Dedicated corridors for patient movement so that the other areas remain protected. Patient to wear well-fitting source control subject to the clinical condition of the patient. Yes, if he can, then he must wear a well-fitting, sorry for this spelling mistake, it's not cell, it is well-fitting source control, which is a mask or an N95 mask. And when the patient vacates a room, allow time for air changes to remove the infectious particles in the air. So close the room for duration of time. Now, if there are 12 air changes per hour, then you need to close that room for 35 minutes only. If there are more number of changes, then it will be shorter time frame. But this is how it is computed. So you can use this. There is a source, the reference I have given here. You can look at the table that CDC has given. It's a beautiful resource that can be used. Next, let us look at the aerosol generating procedures, and we have 4 factors to consider when we talk about aerosol generating procedures. So 4 factors that relate to risk. So whenever the air is forced over a moist respiratory mucosa, this will generate aerosol. Now, what are the occasions when it happens? So when we are talking, when we are breathing, when we are coughing, we are sneezing, or when there is intubation being done, or you are doing any manipulation in the oropharynx, or when you are intubating bronchoscopy and those kind of procedures. The next one is the symptoms and the disease severity. Obviously, this will determine the viral load. Distance, the respiratory emissions are densest to the close. So if you are far away from the patient, the risk is less. If you are close to the patient, the risk is high. And you can imagine if the bronchoscopy is being done, or when the intubation is being done, laryngoscopy is being done, you are actually very close to the patient. So therefore, the risk is highest. Ventilation in the area. So if the area is not well ventilated, the risk is higher. If the area is well ventilated, if you are in that negative pressure room, then obviously the risk will be much lesser. Duration of exposure. So shorter the duration, the better it is. And these factors don't play one by one. They all play together. So the combining multiple factors increases the risk. So sustained proximity to a highly symptomatic patient, there will be a high risk of infection. So by contrast, limited exposure to an asymptomatic patient at a distance, and if both people, the healthcare provider and the patient have worn the mask, the risk will be limited. So this is what we need to understand. And then based on this, the hospital must define the procedures which are aerosol generating procedures, and then have the protocols in place. So these procedures will be carried out in a certain room which has a good ventilation, preferably negative pressure isolation, and then that is what is going to reduce the risk. So good ventilation is likely a mitigation factor in the enclosed spaces, but the ventilation alone is not sufficient. So we have to use other protections as well. Limiting visitor access, this is common sense, can be done by allowing patients to talk to their family members over phone or video calling, have this scheduled for visit, control the visits, have the visitors comply with all the precautions that you have, screening systems that you have, educate them on the risk associated, and enforce hand hygiene, PPE if required, like the body suits and all, and not to be present when the aerosol generating procedures are being done. So patient relatives or the visitors should not be anywhere near when these procedures are being done, and visit only in the designated area or the room. They should not be allowed to roam anywhere else in the hospital. Next, we come to the environmental infection control. Nothing new in this, because our standard hospital grade disinfectants are sufficient for ensuring disinfection as far as COVID-19 is concerned. So we need to continue to use them. We need to dedicate medical equipment. So if you have a COVID part of the hospital and the non-COVID part of the hospital, then the COVID part of the hospital must have dedicated equipment. And if the equipment is being moved from one side to other, then it must be surfaces should be cleaned and it should be disinfected. Then the laundry, that is the used linen, the biomedical waste, the food and beverage services, there are procedures already defined. The biomedical waste guidelines are there separately. They need to be implemented. And the disposable containers for food, hospital laundry needs to be transported in the closed bags and using the appropriate transportation so that it is not, nobody is exposed while it is being transported. And then in the laundry needs to be disinfected. So standard laundering procedures are sufficient, just the transportation needs to be taken care of. Next, we come to the air infection isolation rooms. So these are the specific requirements. It needs to be a single bed negative pressure room, 12 air changes recommended. Minimum is 6 air changes per hour. 12 Pascal negative pressure is required. So minus 12 pressure is required. Exhaust has to be either discarded outside the building, or if it is being recirculated, then it is recirculated only after treatment. And any of these treatment methods can be used, HEPA or the chemical treatment or the heating or ultraviolet. The traffic through these rooms should be minimized, so you don't allow people to come in and you don't allow people to go out very frequently. And then monitor the pressure differential. There is a Magnehalic gauge that is available. This must be installed, and you should be very sure about the pressure differential inside the room and outside the room, so that you are sure about that the air infection isolation is actually working. Next, we come to PPE. Now, I'm not going to cover what PPE is, but we need to be able to train our healthcare personnel in such a manner that they are able to demonstrate when to use PPE. Typically, not everyone in the hospital will be aware when to use PPE, so they want to be trained what PPE to use when and how to do a proper donning doffing. This I think a lot of us have learned, but there is still, I see in hospitals where the certain category of staff, typically the technicians or many times the housekeeping staff, the ward boys, etc., are not very comfortable. They have not learned it correctly, so they need to be trained. Disposal of used PPE is necessary, and there are limitations with each PPE. So this must be, people should be aware. For example, just wearing an N95 mask is of no value if it is not sealed. So if the air leaks from sides, then obviously it is not working. This must be known. Reusable PPE needs to be properly cleaned and decontaminated and maintained during and after the use. So what PPE is? A quick recap of that. So we have filtering face piece respirators. This is what we are very, very aware. N95 masks. Important thing to remember is that they must be used before entering the care area and throughout the period of exposure and discarded thereafter. They are single-use masks. There are some methods that have been described how to reuse them. So if you are reusing these masks, then please follow those methods diligently. Typically, it means that you are at the end of use, you pack them in an envelope, and store them for a certain period of time, and thereafter only use it again. They must be used when performing aerosol generating procedures, and there are requirements of medical evaluation that a person should be evaluated whether he is fit to use the N95 mask. It needs to be trained and the fit has to be tested. So we need to test whether the mask is fitting properly or not. And it must have the head straps and not the ear loops. N95 mask with the ear loops cannot give you the kind of seal that is required for it to be working. So this is necessary. The next variety is the elastomeric respirator. So this is how it looks. It gives the same level of protection as the N95 mask. It has a requirement of medical evaluation, so the person has to be fit to be using it. Training is required and fit testing is also required. And they have additional maintenance requirement because these are reusable, so they need to be cleaned and disinfected after every use. Next are the powered air purifying respirators. That's something known as PAPR. I'll just show you a picture, but they are battery operated blowers are there which push air and therefore makes the reduce the breathing effort, and the air is filtered, so it is actually safe. They can be of two varieties. They can be tight fitting or loose fitting. The tight fitting ones have to be fit tested. That means you have to test whether they are fitting properly. And these tight fitting ones cannot be used with people with the facial hairs. So if someone has a beard, then obviously it cannot be used. The loose fitting ones do not require any fit testing. So this is how it looks. So this particular one, the one on left is the tight fitting PAPR, where you have a battery powered unit, which is typically held with a belt in the waist. And you have a line that, provides the air. Then this is a loose fitting one on the right. So you can see that there is no very tight fitting mask on the face, so it is comfortable for the wearer, and this is how it looks. So these are the options that are available. These are all the recyclable ones, so you can reuse them after disinfecting. Eye protection, important thing to remember is that it must cover the sides as well, not only the front. The eyewear that covers the front is the safety glasses and not the eye protection for COVID-19. This one has to have this side and the top, the bottom protection as well. Gloves, of course, important thing is that if they are visibly contaminated or if they are damaged, they need to be changed. The CDC Atlanta says that there is no need to double glove. Gowns, similarly, there is no need to wear double gowns, but the gowns have to be used, worn before entering the patient area and then discarded thereafter. So what are the recommendations? So finally, you have a hospital. You need to build a filtration system of triage and screening. Triage is for patients, screening is for all the visitors and your staff. And then within the hospital, you must have universal source control, targeted testing, processes for exposed healthcare personnel, patient placement methods, PPEs, aerosol generating procedures as to what will be done, the environmental infection control, and airborne isolation room. So this is what is, in nutshell, is the requirement for the hospitals. And this is something that we will need to continue implementing even after the pandemic. I mean, the nature of the virus is such that it will recur. At least that is what the present prediction is. And therefore, we will need to be putting these systems in place for good. And lastly, the framework that for the non-COVID clinical care, I'm going to take just maybe 5-7 minutes more. So the key considerations are to be ready to rapidly detect and respond to surge in cases. So we need to be aware of the local trends. So please follow what is happening around you. If you are in a city, then you should know what is the local case count, the deaths patterns, and the number of cases, the positivity rates, etc. Because this is going to affect your non-COVID clinical care in the hospital. Before you accept patients, please ensure that you have staff, you have bed capacity and the PPE available. So this is of course common sense, but prepare them before you start accepting the patients. So this is part of readiness. Then provide patient care in a safest way possible. We discussed those 4 approaches in the beginning, use them and then make it safe for everyone. And the services may need to expand gradually. So as we gradually unlock, as we bring the situation under control, we gradually open up the services. Of course, the temptation will be to open up as quickly, but then this is not what needs to be or what can be done. So this is the framework as to what kind of non-COVID clinical care you will entertain and under what community situation. So the community transmission is in three grades. There is a substantial community transmission, that is there are large number of cases. There is a moderate community transmission, or there is a minimal community transmission. So under these 3 situations, you have a non-COVID patient landing up with you, and the patients, the likelihood of harm to the patient is high. That means the patient has such clinical condition where the patient may suffer harm, death or disability or a prolonged illness. For example, a myocardial infarction or acute abdomen, major trauma like that. So you will have to provide care, and for such high degree of likelihood of harm, whether there is a substantial risk or a moderate risk or a minimal risk, the care has to be provided. So these are the kind of patients who have to be addressed. There is no option with this. Then you have the second category of patients where the deferral of the inpatient care is likely to cause harm, but the chances are less. So you can have the chronic conditions, you can have the musculoskeletal injuries, elective procedures, the patient needs care, but you can defer. So this is what needs to be done in the 3 transmission situations. So if there is a substantial community transmission, then you don't provide it. I mean, you defer the care. So if care cannot be delivered remotely, arrange for inpatient care as soon as feasible, which means you defer till such time the risk is reduced. The next one is the moderate community transmission. So if the care cannot be delivered remotely, then work towards expanding inpatient care. So this is a situation where the community transmission is reducing, it is to a moderate degree. Then you can possibly accept patients provided your own situation is such that you can provide care. And lastly, when there is a minimal community transmission, then of course the patients can be accepted. And the last one is the least likelihood or the harm is unlikely. So the patient is coming for routine primary care, for the care of well-controlled clinical conditions, etc. So in such situations for elective procedures, in the substantial community transmission, you defer this care, you don't provide care, you defer such patients. In the moderate, you you defer till such time it can be done. And of course, when there is a minimal transmission, the care can be provided. So this is the framework that has been given by the CDC Atlanta, a very simple device actually, if you really look at it, easy to understand, and that is how you need to prioritize the care in the hospitals. This is going to continue even when we are, over after this pandemic. So this is what we need to figure out. So I have finished. If there are questions, we'll be happy to take.
Thank you, Dr. Verma. That was a wonderful presentation. There are few questions in the Q&A box, which I would request you to please address. So the first question is, visitors are strictly not allowed in private, but government settings, the situation is not same. Do you have any comment on manpower management in government setting and also on recruitment of professionals on contract?
Okay. So as far as visitor management is concerned, the requirement of managing visitor is not whether it is a private setup or a government setup. The requirement is of a peculiar set of conditions that this pandemic has presented us. So the requirements are same, whether a private or a government setup. Now, in the government setup, yes, there may be staff shortages, there may be issues that are that need to be addressed as to the amount of control that you can have over the situation. But I don't see any option with us but to enforce visitor control even in the government hospitals. I mean, eventually, look at it like this: a visitor is also subject to the risk that is there in the hospital, and he is also a source of potential risk to others. As will be in a private setup as well. So to say that there will be a different set of stipulations for the government hospital, I don't think that's right. The requirement is from the infection control perspective and from the safety perspective, which remains the same. Now, in the government setup, yes, if there is a need to have a security staff to be deployed in order to control, I guess there is no option. So the hospital management must look at this aspect and provide this necessary staff to regulate the visitors.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. Like there will be visitors coming in, but for government setup, more strict rules needs to be in place so that visitors will come. But definitely, where are they placed? Where are they coming? What is the time? How many times they are coming has to be checked in.
We can regulate actually. That is what the patients will understand better rather than banning it altogether. Because obviously there is so much of apprehension in the environment about the disease itself that people would not like to leave their near and dear ones all by themselves. So you need to have firstly encourage communication, the non-visiting kind of communication. So allow phones, allow video calls. The second method is that regulation possibly is something that can be done. Well, of course, there will be issues of regulation in the sense that the staff may be required. You may need to provide PPEs or masks, or still deny some people who will not be wearing masks. So those things are, I guess, inescapable. We can't possibly say that people can visit without the safeguards. Those safeguards will have to be in place.
Okay.
And about the contract staff, the second part of the question, I think every government department, I mean, I was part of the government for a good 28 years. I am aware that every government department can obtain staff on contract. I think a lot of government departments have already started doing so. And when it comes to the healthcare professionals, I think the problem is not whether the hospital wants the contract staff. I mean, it can always get it, or rather it can always want it. But whether so much of healthcare manpower is available for deployment, I mean, there is an overall shortage. So even if you take out an advertisement saying that you are going to give the job on contract of a certain category of professionals, you may not have those professionals coming forward. I mean, there is a deficiency in that sense. There is a net deficiency. So that deficiency will manifest somewhere.
Yeah. So the next question is, what will be the single bed negative pressure room cost per day? PP is many a time seen as an improperly worn in some hospital, which the media is covering. What do you say for this, sir? We have seen pandemic in past year and still in the same, but people train them. It is individual responsibility to see how they follow the principles for protecting self and others. Like it's partially answered by the person who asked the question, but how do you see like the cost for negative single bed negative pressure room cost per day and PPE not being properly worn, which you have covered in your PPT also, but what should be the regulations for the PPE to be worn correctly and how?
I think what works, okay, let's come to the cost factor first. Now, if you were to create a negative pressure isolation room, which is also air conditioned in that sense, then of course it is expensive. You need to have a AHU, that is the air handling unit. You need to have a cooling system and a filtration system, and then that will provide the sterile or the safe air inside the rooms. However, there are other ways of creating a negative pressure room. If you look at some of the recommendations where people have improvised, people have used the exhaust fans. So what happens is that a negative pressure is what? Essentially the air coming in and the air going out. So if you take out more air from the room than the air coming in, it will generate a negative pressure inside. Now, the stipulation that you must have 12 air changes per hour and the pressure differential must be 12 Pascal. This may be a challenging task in a improvised system, but some amount of negative pressure can always be created by putting the exhaust fans. In fact, I have seen in some of the hospitals where they have used such a thing. It does not create negative pressure of 12 Pascal. Definitely, it does not create minus 12. But then it does create some amount of negative pressure. And with this, if you use a hood or a vacuum box or a vacuum shroud, that gives some amount of protection, which is better than not having a protection at all. So when we can't provide ideal, we need to, at least go towards that direction. Well, I agree the cost will be a factor, but then I think cost of safety is possibly much higher than cost of providing such a facility.
Yeah, and the second part of the question is PPE. PPE is many times seen not to be worn in properly in some hospitals.
I saw it in one of the hospitals. If you have a method where there is a compulsory checking. See, what CDC recommends is that when a person is wearing PPE, there should be two people. Though they say that the option is also that you stand in front of a mirror and also wear the PPE. But then the ideal is that you have two people. So one is observing the other person wearing the PPE. So this is the simplest way to point out errors in the PPE, that it is not closed properly, it is not worn properly, the steps were not correct, or the hand hygiene steps were missing in between, the mask is not well fitting. So those kind of things can be covered. The second is the staff needs to be aware. I think in all of us, we have a very good, very well developed instinct of self-preservation. So once we realize the risk, we'll be able to protect ourselves, because once we know that, okay, the PPE is the only way, which is only thing which is standing between the infection and the protection. So then we will be able to do this. And still you will have, I am aware that you will still have situations where some people will just not comply. And then some amount of strictness in terms of disciplinary actions is necessary, because the governments provide cover to the healthcare professionals when the infections are contracted while providing patient care. There is a provision of compensation, and if you can use this as a deterrence, that if you willfully not wear PPE properly, then this compensation or this kind of the coverage is not available, then possibly it will work. It's something similar when you have a road traffic accident and when the person is not wearing a helmet, then there is a problem with the insurance claim. So it's something like this. But some amount of deterrence has to be built in. We have people who will simply not understand whatever you may do.
Yeah, completely agree. Like there has to be a quality check at each time. Adherence to quality. Actually,
Important,
yeah.
This I have seen work. So if you have, let's say, a person who's supervising the PPE wearing, you assign duties. So you have change rooms, and in those change rooms, you assign duties. Okay, so when the PPE is being worn, today this person will do duty, tomorrow someone else will do duty, and then we'll actually verify that the person has worn it correctly. This simple supervision will ensure that the compliance is much better.
Yeah, some like in regular cases, not during the COVID, there are hospitals who do there are monitoring squads who come and visit and see that all the parameters are met. So those kind of like
That's also a method. Yes, it's also a method, but please remember that the squad will be roaming all over the hospital. That may not be a very good idea. In a COVID setting, you don't want people to move unnecessarily. Right. So that's one aspect. But if it's a COVID hospital, the squad is wearing the PPE which is prescribed. They can go around monitoring, supervising. Yes.
Yeah. And next question is, what to do when you become breathless when you climb stairs with triple layer double mask on? Palpitations are present. Like
this pause.
Yeah, this is actually one of the reason people are not wearing mask properly.
Huh. Gee, it's a problem. It's a problem because a lot of us are not comfortable wearing mask, and obviously it creates a hindrance in our normal breathing. The effort of breathing goes very high. The amount of effort that you have to put to breathe in is far more when you're wearing a very tightly sealed N95 mask. It's not easy. I mean, I have used it and I'm certain of it. However, let's just look at the other side of the story. The risks associated with getting infected are very, very different. So once we understand that, yes, some of the hospitals I have seen have provided these PAPR equipment, which makes things very easy because the air is pushed inside that hood in a loose fitting one or in the mask in the tight fitting one. It reduces the effort of breathing significantly. So it is actually very comfortable. The only problem is the cost. I mean, that particular equipment costs. It is it can be reused multiple number of times, but the equipment is expensive as of now. I mean, it costs 50,000-60,000 rupees for one, and then you have a hood that is another 3 to 4, maybe 5,000 rupees. It's expensive, but then it can be used in such situations where you have very high exposure in the emergency departments, where you have people working and handling large number of patients. Their exposure is obviously very, very high. You can't rely on just on a well-fitting mask. I mean, they may still be exposed. So in such situations, selected ones you can wear. You can use this PAPR also.
Yeah, like in low settings where the infrastructure challenges are there, PAPR might not be possible. And like it's people are saying it's easier and it's better to wear a triple layer mask than to wear an oxygen cylinder. So
Yeah, I mean that's one decision. I mean that's the decision that we need to make. So that's what it is. But I think healthcare professionals, the hospital managements. I mean, I am from that side. I would encourage the managements to look at this. That in areas where you have a very high degree of exposure, emergency departments, you are a dedicated COVID hospital. You have a rush of patients who come to you. Now, simply relying on the mask or the face shield may not be sufficient. It's a good idea to provide PAPR. I mean, imagine the amount of confidence that your staff will have if they have a proper device to protect them, and the amount of motivation they will have to work in such a setting that they are protected. So this is it's like going to battlefield with a bulletproof jacket. You are very comfortable. I mean, so you still know that a bullet can hit you, but if you have a jacket, it gives you a confidence that yes, okay, at least there is some protection available. But not having a protection is not nice. The management should consider. After all, when it comes to the cost of losing someone, I think the costs of providing PAPR is minuscule in that comparison.
can you please tell on MISC management in children? I'm not sure if I spelled it right, miscellaneous or MISC management in children. What preparedness we must have to face the third wave?
Well, I think there are a lot of discussion around this topic. And the discussion is generated by the fact that as the vaccination progresses, the only category of population which is unvaccinated is children. This discussion is also fueled by the fact that we know little about the epidemiology of the virus in children. We don't know how it evolves, or at least many questions are unanswered. The vaccine themselves have a EUA, that emergency use authorization, so they are not authorized for regular use. The vaccines have not been tested in the children, or at least the trials are on. We still don't know whether they can be used in small children, younger children. So these uncertainties are generating this discussion. At the same time, there are also various papers. In fact, yesterday only I saw one where it has estimated that the risk to children is not same as the other population. It's not disproportionately more. So we still don't know. I mean, we will know only when it happens. But preparation is the key, and handling pediatric population is a challenge, that I must say. When you have to ventilate a child, when you have to put an IV line for a child, when you have to do these things, it becomes even more complex when it comes to a child than to an adult. So therefore, skill is something that needs to be addressed. Uh, I understand that there are a lot of programs that the governments are organizing for training the healthcare staff in handling children. And in these situations, I think a very good triaging system should work better. That you are very quickly able to sort children who require specialized care and ship them to places where specialized care is available, rather than trying to do everything in one place. It may not be practical, really. But yes, there are a lot of questions which are still, for which still there is very limited answers available. Training is something that we can do, but predicting whether it will affect and then to what degree, I don't want to hazard a guess here. I mean, I'm not the person, I'm not the epidemiologist, so I guess there are people who are addressing it. My domain is hospital, so I'm kind of more more definitive about that.
Next question is, can you share your thoughts on how to handle OPD service in private clinic, or what design consideration one must keep in mind for a new clinic?
Okay, so if you can have a method where you put simple screening in place, so simple fever screening and the symptom screening. So if you are building a new clinic, yes, have a filtration system. Instead of patients walking in right up to your chamber directly, have a screening in front, so that you don't allow everyone else to come in. That's one. Secondly, enforce masking. So source control is necessary. Protect yourself as well. And if you are a clinic, and if you can afford, a PIPR is a very good idea here. You will be at peace, because you will be protected, and you know that even if a person has not followed all the steps in this screening and all the steps in protecting himself, then you are, to a degree, you are protected. So that's one. Not allowing crowding is a very good idea. Improving ventilation is a very good idea. So even in the clinics which are not air conditioned, have the exhaust systems. That's not very expensive. Exhaust systems which will keep throwing out air. When that happens, the air circulation increases. You increase the number of air changes in the room, which will have the effect of dilution. That works beautifully. With every additional air change in hour, you are actually reducing the risk significantly. So these are the steps that you can take: screen, ensure mask, protect yourself, have a good ventilation. In fact, forced ventilation. You force the air to exit with the exhaust fans, or you force more air to be pushed in, so that it pushes the old with the stale air out. So basically improving the ventilation. These things work.
Even cloth double mask also cause CO2 or carbon dioxide retention symptoms within half to 1 hour. How to deal such situation in non-medical person?
Well, I think the amount of literature that I have seen, nowhere they have said that it is creating a disproportionate risk. Yes, it might be causing the carbon dioxide retention, though. If you really look at the whole design of the cloth mask and the permeability of the oxygen and the gases, personally, I don't think it would. But nonetheless, it has not been shown to have any significant risk in terms of person inhaling the carbon dioxide. So I guess that should not be a concern. I mean, I do several kilometers walking every day wearing a double mask, and I have not faced very serious issues in terms of carbon dioxide inhalation. If that is a concern, I don't think it's a very serious concern. Yes, it might be causing a bit of that, but I don't think it's a concern.
As a hospital administrator, the cost of PPE and other COVID area preparation, what are the best cost-effective methods to have a COVID area for common middle-class people?
In a private hospital, the most expensive item is the air conditioning. Okay, so so when we say that cost of PPE is high, yes, it is a cost, and there is no doubt about it. But what is the other option that we have? There are methods that have been described as to how to recycle PPEs. Please be very sure when you are recycling PPEs that it is safe for use. There are very clear reprocessing instructions. So if you are, let us say, reprocessing the N95 mask for use, or if you are, if you allow patients to reuse a cloth mask, then please have a very clear guideline how it will be used. It has to be washed in soap and water and should preferably be dried in the sun. I'm talking about the cloth mask. The N95 masks and the surgical masks are made of material which will get spoiled if you wet them. So cleaning, washing is not something that is available to these kind of masks. But there are recycling, reprocessing methods described. Please implement those systems strictly and have a validation, sterilization validation step built in. That a confirmation that this step has been completed correctly, then only it is going to work. Recycling is, yes, it's one of the methods. I think till in the last year's episode, we had a serious concern about the availability of PPEs. This year, I'm not hearing this, I'm not seeing this problem to that extent. But yes, some of the hospitals may like to recycle, and when they do, please have a system to reprocess them properly.
Next question is the psychological satisfaction of wearing PPE and feeling I'm protected will have boosting effect on immunity?
I think this I feel is possibly the most dangerous situation where I'm wearing N95 mask, and I'll show you one mask. In fact, I have it here. So I'm wearing this kind of a mask which says N95 written here, and it has the ear loops. Now, this is not the mask that you should be wearing in the hospital. This is for public places. I'm sitting alone in my office. Somebody walks in, or when I'm walking on the street, yes, I'm wearing this. Subject to that, there is no lockdown. But when you are wearing an N95 mask, when you're wearing PPE, please wear it correctly. The whole idea is that the respiratory secretions and the aerosol that is generated either by you or by a person in front of you does not reach either of you. So your aerosols should stay with you and his aerosols should stay with him. That's the whole idea. And this will be possible only when you wear the PPE properly. That is the reason the supervision, that you have a squad checking everybody's PPE very often. You have a person supervising how the PPE is being worn. That is where it works. This psychological satisfaction is dangerous. I'm 100% sure that you have to be very, very suspicious of you wearing. I mean, I'm very suspicious when I'm wearing a PPE. We often check whether the fit is right, whether there is a leak from the side, and I mean, it is for our own protection. Yes, we do sometimes ignore this. That's not good.
So next question, I think it's not directly related to the topic, but the question is whether the stem cell transplantation can cure the COVID infection. So,
stem cell treating the COVID infection? Well, no. I mean, at least to my awareness levels, and the current answer is no. You see, COVID is a infection by a virus. Okay, coronavirus is the term that we are now very familiar with. Now, the way body responds to a virus is by producing the antibodies. The virus presents certain antigens, that means triggers to the body. The body processes those triggers and produces antibodies against those antigens. Now, these antibodies neutralize the virus. Now, if you are thinking that you will have stem cells being triggered to produce these antibodies, well, we haven't reached that stage, at least not to my knowledge. We have reached that stage of science where we could possibly do this. Stem cells basically are the cells which are precursor cells. So you can trigger them to do a certain function. But whether you can tweak them to generate specific antibodies, well, I don't think I should be answering this question. That's not my domain. It will not be correct to answer this question, for me at least.
The last question is, do we have to wear mask while cycling? If yes, is it going to cause carbon dioxide retention and eventually leading to unconsciousness?
The short answer is no. It will not cause any carbon dioxide retention and it will not cause any unconsciousness. Okay, if you are cycling in the outdoors, when you are not in a crowd, wear cloth mask and cycle away to glory. No issues at all. I don't think it should create even an apprehension of carbon dioxide retention. I mean, the very effort of cycling will force you to take such breaths where I don't think carbon dioxide can accumulate in any significant quantities around you. So that should not be a concern.
So that's it on the question and answer side. We come to the close of the session now. So really, I would like to extend our thanks to you, Dr. Verma, for giving time today and addressing all the questions from our participants. The presentation was very helpful and informative. For our participants, your feedback is very important to us. There's a link in the chat box. Kindly provide your feedback on today's session. Our next session on COVID-19 series is scheduled on Tuesday, June 22nd at 6 p.m. by our eminent speaker, Dr. Indu Arneja, on the topic psychosocial well-being of healthcare professionals during the pandemic. Please do register yourself for the upcoming sessions. Thank you for your participation. Thank you, Dr. Verma. Have a wonderful evening ahead. Stay safe. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, ma'am. I had a good time, lovely time talking this subject, and it is at the moment close to my heart because this is something that we all need to do in a very near future. We will need to gear up our hospitals to function in this manner. But thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity of sharing my ideas.
Thank you so much for coming here and sharing. Thank you so much.
We can close the session, ma'am, now?
Yeah. Manjeet, request you to kindly close the session.
Sure, ma'am. So it is closed for participants?
Yeah.
I think that's a good number you had now. I think around 80 participants or so?
Yes, we reached 80. And this session is also recorded, so it will be on our YouTube channel.
On our website, is that?
Yes, I'll share you the link.
Okay. No, website I have seen, so one can visit. But thank you, ma'am. Great.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manjeet. Right.